We're developing what are called organoids, brain organoids. So in Petri dish, we're growing brains from neuron cells. Yeah. Yeah, we're growing little brains.
Today is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Tiffeny Todd. Listen to last week's episode 112, for part 1 of our conversation, because if you're at all confused, we are just pretty much diving right in here where we left off last week.
They signaled their mind to the neurons in this assigned organoid, and they signaled the right image. That might be proof of survival.
In today's episode, I am speaking with Dr. Tiffeny Todd. She earned her PhD in physics from the University of California, Irvine, where she researched a mechanism believed to give birds their ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field to navigate.
And that's something that could conceivably be done if we can better understand not just scientists, but I think in collaboration with mediums, talking to those on the other side. Now that you are on the other side, how does that tethering mechanism work? I think that's my question. You were asking about the double slit experiment, which I really think sort of illustrates the questions that we're still grappling with quantum physics, and it helps to illustrate the different interpretations of quantum physics. So I guess to help visualize this experiment, imagine a pool of water, and imagine like ocean waves that are crashing against a dam. Okay, or some body like lake, like big waves that are crashing against a dam. And let's imagine that there's a crack in the dam that's pretty large. You can see through it such that the waves can pass through. And when the wave passes through, rather than hitting the wall straight, as it passes through, the wave front turns into a semicircle. Sort of like if you were to throw a pebble in a pond, you know how the waves would go out in concentric circles if you threw a wave into a pond. Well, that's what happens on the other side of the dam when the water passes through the crack. And so imagine that there's a huge seawall on the other side of the dam, really tall. And when the peak of that wave crest hits that seawall, it's going to leave a big watermark, sort of like right in the center. So now imagine that there's another crack in the dam. So we've got 2 cracks. And as the water passes through, now we've got 2 circular wave fronts that are passing through those cracks. This is where it gets interesting, because those wave fronts are going to interfere with each other, either constructively, where 2 peaks are going to meet and they're going to double, or you have a peak and a trough, they're going to meet and the whole wave is going to cancel out. So when those 2 wave fronts hit the seawall, what you're going to see is you're going to see a big peak in the middle, and then you're going to see a place on either side where there's no wave. And then another peak where the wave crests are interfering constructively and they're hitting the seawall, and then a place where there's no wave. So you have this sort of one wave, and then you have these wave fronts, sort of like vertical blinds, where every other vertical blind is missing. And so you can sort of see these bands of light. And the most important thing is in the center is the strongest band. So when we see that pattern against the seawall, we know that waves have passed through the two cracks in the dam. Now imagine that there's no water, and instead what we're doing is we're firing BB guns. Like we have a BB gun and you're firing BBs through the crack. You would expect on the other side of the wall for the BBs that make it through the cracks to just form 2 bands of BBs. But when we take something like a subatomic particle, like an electron, and we send it through the double slits, that's not what we see. We actually see over time an interference pattern build up, meaning that every time we fire a BB, it doesn't just land behind the slits. Most of them land in the center, meaning in between the two slits. And then some of them land where those water waves were hitting, right? So in those different bands. And so if I fire a BB straight through the slit, why would it sometimes end up over to the right and sometimes end up over to the left? It kind of doesn't make sense. Why, if you fire 100 BBs, would you end up getting a wave pattern against the seawall? So that's the fundamental question that we're trying to address in quantum mechanics. We're trying to calculate, we're coming up with an equation that calculates where will I find the BB? If I fire that BB, and let's call it an electron, if I fire a single electron, where is it going to go? Where is it? What's its position? And we find that there's a certain probability of it hitting in the front and other probabilities of it landing somewhere else. And so if we want to model that probability, we have something called a wave function. And it's just an equation where we add up the probability of it going through the left slit, the probability of the electron going through the right slit, the probability of it going through both slits. And if we add up those probabilities, we have something called a wave function. It's just an equation that allows me to reproduce that interference pattern that we see on the seawall. I can basically model it on a computer, and I can reproduce the firings of thousands of electrons, and I can get that pattern. So there are three interpretations of quantum mechanics, and they boil down to how do we interpret that equation? What is that equation actually telling us? The equation tells us what we're going to see when the electrons hit the seawall, but does it tell us anything about what the electron is doing from the time we fire it to the time it hits the seawall? And that's the debate. That's where the different interpretations come from. So in the Copenhagen interpretation, it says that, well, you can't say anything about the electron after you fire it. You can't say anything until you measure it and it hits the seawall. Yes, we have this equation that describes that its position moves around probabilistically, but we can't say that anything about how the electron went through the two slits, if it went through the left or through the right, or through both. So that would be the Copenhagen interpretation. And a lot of people have misinterpreted that to say, oh, well, if we can model the electron's behavior as a wave, the electron must become a wave as it goes through the slits. So we fire the electron from our gun, and it's a particle. It becomes a wave when it goes through the slits, and then when it hits the seawall, it becomes a particle again. And that's really not what the Copenhagen interpretation says. It just says that the probability of where we're going to find the electron moves around like a wave, not that the electron has become a wave as it goes through the slits. The other interpretation is called this many worlds interpretation, which says that, well, whenever the electron encounters some sort of interaction, like with two slits, in one reality, the electron goes through the left slit, but immediately another parallel universe is created in which the electron goes through the right slit. So that the equation, it's not that there's a probability of going left and a probability of going right. Both things happen. The universe isn't probability. God isn't playing dice. It's just that we only see the electron going one way, but there's another universe that's created and the electron is going the other way in that universe. That's the many worlds interpretation. And then finally, the other interpretation of what's happening is the wave function isn't assigned to the particle itself. It's not the particle that's following the wave function, but it's imagine that the electron is on top of that ocean of water that we visualized before, sort of like a ping pong ball floating atop waves. And so what happens is that the particle is being guided through the slits by this wave. And so every time you send the particle along the wave, its trajectory slightly deviates. And that's why we see the particles hitting as if they were being guided by a wave. That would be the pilot wave interpretation, or in other words, Bohmian mechanics, which in my view is the most intuitive interpretation of what I think is physically going on. Now, the mathematics of Bohmian mechanics and the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics are exactly the same. They make the exact same predictions. It's just Bohmian mechanics, because you have this pilot wave to consider and not just the particle. The math is maybe just a little bit more cumbersome and complicated. And so most physicists have adopted the Copenhagen interpretation, I think, as a shortcut, but it has led to some misinterpretations, like in the film What the Bleep Do We Know?, which I really love the spirit of the film, but a lot of scientists sort of criticize this attempt by those of us who believe consciousness can be non-local and have non-local effects, but using the idea that it's an observer. It's not until someone looks at the particle that it becomes a wave and collapses into a particle. And so I think as we attempt to validate non-local consciousness and validate parapsychology, I think it's really important that we sort of clarify these sort of technical details so that we're not then accused of misinterpreting quantum physics to explain parapsychological phenomenon. And that's why I think it's important to sort of set the record straight on that.
So you are talking about, you're just sharing some of these personal experiences, and that's crazy as a scientist that, I wish more scientists had this. But did you also have any like what the fuck verified personal experiences? And
Oh,
what were they?
oh yeah, absolutely. I'd say most of the impactful experiences that I've had have been verified. I think one of the first ones was with a psychic I know who sees auras. And this is the first psychic I ever went to when I was very young, in my 20s. And I was super excited about a new job opportunity, and I was moving, and I was just very excited. And I was really conveying that to her. And she said, that's all good and well, but you have this huge gash through your aura in your heart center. Someone's really just hurt you. Do you want to talk about that? Or do you just want to keep pretending everything is fine? And my face just went like, my jaw dropped. I was like, how did she know that that was actually true? So that told me that, I think there really is something to this idea that people are able to perceive an energy field that conveys someone's aspects of someone's psyche, of someone's thought processes. And so this would be different from something like biophotons or thermal heat energy. We all give off light. That's true. Scientists are aware that we all give off light. But the light we give off is not it's in the infrared range, right? So it doesn't have different colors necessarily. We also give off biophotons as a result of metabolism, but those biophotons are very, very weak in intensity. So it's not something the human eye can perceive. So I don't think the frequency of thermal energy or the intensity of biophotons can account for what someone sees when they're seeing an aura. I really think that the auric sight is sort of like a third eye type of sight. It's something different that we're not yet measuring with our scientific instrumentation. The other experience I had was actually attending a workshop where I had to give a reading to someone else, and it was a mediumship reading. And I'd read a book by a psychic called Mia's World. She's a British psychic. And it's a great book because she's teaching a journalist how to develop her own psychic intuition. And so just using those basic tools and attending a workshop with James Van Praagh, I attempted to give someone a reading. And it really was as simple as just having had practice meditating before. So I knew how to really sort of clear my mind of thoughts and of visual imagery and just sort of have a blank screen in front of myself and just sort of sit with that in an intention that I want information about this person or someone who has passed or a loved one of this person. And so I describe the details in my documentary, but what's incredible is an image did appear out of the blackness of my mind. And it was strange. It had no meaning for me, but when I conveyed it to the person I was giving the reading for, she said, "Oh, absolutely, that's my father, definitely." So, and then another woman as well, I conveyed information that seems strange to me, but she immediately recognized as being relevant. So that was very validating for me. I've also had experiences with remote viewing, that are similar to that. I attended the workshop with Laura Lynn Jackson, and she said, "I'm going to put a picture on the screen. I want you to draw what you're going to see in just 5 minutes." And sure enough, I was able to draw the picture, and I was shocked when she displayed it that the image that appeared in my mind was similar to what was there. It didn't happen right away. I think the first impressions I got, I just cleared my mind, because I think the hardest thing is to distinguish between what are my own thought processes versus what is non-local information coming in. So it's a constant process of going back to that meditative state and clearing your own psyche, and then waiting for something new to come in, something new and unexpected, and then drawing that. So that was another really sort of validating experience. And then the last one I'll share with you, which I won't give too many details because I go into it in the documentary. But I did interview one of the mediums I interviewed in the documentary. I was talking to her about some of the studies that have been done on mediums. And I was planning on ending the segment there. And then my cameraman, he said, "Wait a minute, you're not going to ask her for a reading? Come on, you presented all this evidence that mediums are real. You can't just leave it there." I was like, okay, but the picture I brought of a past relative who had passed, it's not a relative I knew. I didn't really know this person. So I thought there won't be really anything that I can validate if the medium does give me any information. But she did the reading, and by the end, I was sobbing. I was absolutely sobbing. Turns out she ended up solving a cold case, like yeah, like a almost,
What?
yeah, like a almost 50-year-old cold case. I
And
won't
that you have to go to your documentary. Everyone will watch that there.
I won't go into the details of it here, just to avoid trigger warnings. But I will say this, something that's not in the documentary. After I shared with another relative, what was said, and that someone was implicated. And my relative she had a conversation with the man that was implicated and asked this man, "Hey, do you know what happened way back when? Do you know who perpetrated this crime?" And the man said, "Oh, I think it was this person." And they hung up. 5 minutes later, the man who was implicated, he calls back and says, "You think it was me, don't you?" Because,
Wait, calls you?
okay, so this was my mother. I told her the story, and she said, "Well, I'm gonna just ask him, hey, do you know anything about
Okay.
that crime?" And he said, "Oh no, I think it was that person who did it." And then hangs up the phone with him. And 5 minutes later, he calls her back and he's like, "Panicked. You think I did it, don't you? Because that was the rumor, but I took care of that."
That's so scary.
So not exactly an admission, but for me, it really made sense when the medium gave me this information. It just helped me to make sense of so many things in my past. I'd always been afraid of this person. I could never understand, almost irrationally afraid of this individual. And now it just made sense when she told me that. So I would say those are all of my stories of, I guess, personal anecdotal stories where, parapsychology has proven or seemed to be real to me.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, everyone's gonna have to watch your documentary. We should maybe do some little thing where, I don't know, get everyone to watch a certain day for what the fuck and do a little watch party. Some way. Well, but anyway, I can cross promote it. Let me know.
Absolutely.
So I'm gonna ask you a question, and I'm sorry I did not message you this. I just thought of it and realized I should have I asked it last time, but I thought of it with remote viewing. So one really weird thing about remote viewing, as well as a lot of other aspects of this phenomena, time. I know we touched upon it some last time, but for example, there's a story, I believe it was Russell Targ, viewed a certain area and he described it, swimming pool there or water towers. I forget exactly, but he was told wrong. And they found out 20 years ago they had that. Even crazier, someone, and I don't remember who, but essentially remote viewed an area, was told it was wrong, and it was how it ended up being built in the future, which is even harder to explain because, as we discussed a little bit last time, information can be stored in light. It can make sense how people can access the past. And I wish I could remember the details, but I believe again, well, I'm going to have the facts wrong, but this is the concept. It was a parking lot, empty parking lot. They remote viewed a playground, and 20 years later, they ended up building a playground there. Now, how there is, and I don't even know how to ask this, I'm going to have it completely wrong, but essentially there is some subatomic particle that exists that moves in the reverse direction of time. Am I right about that? Do I have this complete? What? I don't know how to ask this because I don't understand it enough.
You're not wrong. But again, getting just a little technicality about that. The particle itself doesn't move backwards in time. That would be antimatter. So the theory of physics that we have that describes small particles is called quantum field theory. And there are great YouTube videos that describe quantum field theory. And one of the ways we calculate interactions between subatomic particles is with equations, but also with these diagrams called Feynman diagrams. And so when, say, two particles come together and collide, and maybe they change form into other particles and energy, etc., we can draw those in different ways. And so an antiparticle traveling through time, in those diagrams, the time axis can be flipped, and you can mathematically assume that the antiparticle travels backwards through time, in that it's reversible. But again, that's a mathematical construct. It's not what's physically happening. So sort of like with our wave function describing an electron going through two slits, yes, the wave function describes the probability of where we're going to find the electron on the seawall, and that probability varies like a wave. It doesn't mean the electron itself is a wave. So we don't have particles that travel backwards in time necessarily that we know of. And there is a speed limit to travel, which is the speed of light. But again, I would say that's in our sort of dimensionality, right? I gave the analogy of, say, a balloon, and if you're on the surface and you can't see inside the balloon, it would take time to travel to the other side of the balloon to see what's going on and get information about that. But if you're in the center of the balloon, maybe you have a view of all trajectories, right? I don't know what's happening in remote viewing, especially when there's a predictive element to it. But what I do know, or what I believe, is that we are not in a deterministic universe, and that consciousness itself is by definition free will. And I explained that in my theory of consciousness, where I think kind of the definition of consciousness is an energy that's deviating particles, subatomic particles, from the trajectory that they would have been on had that consciousness not intervened. And I think that's where agency is arising from. But that said, I think, especially with remote viewing, the longer the time span, the more other variables can come in to alter that particular outcome. And I think it just sort of depends on how firm the trajectory is. If you establish a trajectory that I'm going to see this picture, and again, it's predictive within your own psyche. One thing that can explain it, though, is again, I'll go back to the new field in physics of relativistic quantum information. Prior to the studies, the most recent studies in RQI, it was thought that entanglement had to be created locally. So what does that mean? Again, entanglement is this psychic phenomenon where, you observe one particle is correlated with another particle, no matter how far apart they are, right? And it was thought that, yes, they're correlated, but they were created together. So say out of energy, you create two particles, and one is spinning clockwise, the other is spinning counterclockwise. No matter how far apart you separate them in the universe, no matter, they're going to maintain that correlation. What's remarkable about RQI is that they're discovering that the quantum vacuum itself is an infinitely entangled structure throughout all of space, such that if you have two particles that have never been in contact with one another, they weren't created together, they've never been in contact, and let's say they're so far apart, they're light cones, that they can't be in contact with one another. They can't send light signal messages to one another, right? It's sort of like I'm on Earth and you're in a spaceship orbiting the sun, right? And let's say I have a decision I need to make in 5 minutes. And you could really offer me some great advice to help me make that decision. But unfortunately, I can't take your advice because it takes 8 minutes for a cell phone signal, a light signal, to travel from you to me from the sun, right? And I have to make my decision in 5 minutes. So we are outside of each other's light cones. We can't light signal each other to affect what the other is doing. Nevertheless, with these particles, if they have a quantum antenna, with a quantum antenna, these particles can harvest entanglement from the vacuum and become entangled, even though they've never met. And through that entanglement, they can then get information about the other particle. Now, what I just described to you is an entanglement through space, what we call space-like separated objects. But what's interesting is you can also have these entanglements through time. So you can also have an entanglement through time. And I think that that could be how we can have future predictions or precognition, if you will. I think that's how precognition can occur if consciousness follows some sort of mechanism like I've outlined in my theory, where, again, minds exists as information in the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum is entangled. So physical antenna, the quantum antenna in our neurons, can access that information through the entanglement of the quantum vacuum. And that entanglement can be either through space, so seeing what's happening right now, or through time, seeing what is going to happen or what has happened.
I'm okay. I'm going to be processing this forever. This is so interesting.
And I think one thing I wanted to say about, I guess, my theory of consciousness that I'll add is I think it's important to start with what we know, right? Oftentimes I'll have conversations with mediums about consciousness, and they're bringing in so much information that they get from spirit or from higher levels of consciousness that, I mean, there's so much to talk about. But I think when we want to move a theory forward, a scientific theory forward, we have to start with where science is right now and try to take one step forward. So again, what does science tell us consciousness is right now? We really only know two things about consciousness. We know that thoughts are correlated with neuron firings, right? When neurons fire, for us, that's thought. We see it on brain scans, EEGs, fMRIs, right? Okay, well, what causes a neuron to fire? Well, a voltage change. The neuron lets in a bunch of charged particles, ion, and charges itself up like a cell phone battery. And then it discharges it. And that's what we call a thought. All right. Well, what causes a neuron to change its voltage? Well, it has to let ions in and out. That's how it changes its voltage. How does it do that? It opens up what's called ion channels in its membrane, its skin, if you will. Well, what causes the cell to open and close those ion channels? There are three mechanisms. One is sort of stress, like with a muscle movement. But in the brain, you're really looking at either it's triggered by the voltage of a nearby neuron, which changes its voltage, which causes the neighboring neuron to change its voltage in like a chain reaction. And I think that's what most neurologists think of when they think of thoughts. They think we see something and we get physical stimulus, and that causes neurons to fire, and our thoughts are just in reaction to that. But what about spontaneous thoughts, right? What about that thought that you have out of the blue that isn't triggered by anything in your environment? You're sitting there in meditation for an hour, a thought still pops in, or a psychic is going to have a thought pop in that maybe isn't their own, that they've never thought before. Where does that thought come from? Well, the other thing that causes ion channels to open and close is something called a ligand. It's just a chemical that bonds to the ion channel. And it's like a key. It's like a key that opens the channel or closes the channel. Well, where do these ligands come from, or what controls the production of these ligands? Well, one thing that does influence ligands in neurons are radical pairs, which are those antennas, those quantum antennas that I talked about before. The radical pair, it's like an antenna that can be in one orientation or another orientation. Think of on and off, like an antenna that can be up or down, on and off, okay? And these two orientations then can affect the concentration of certain molecules, right? So if the antenna is up, the neuron is going to open up its ion channels and fire. If the antenna is down, the opposite is going to happen. It's not going to fire. So we know that radical pairs, these quantum antenna, have been shown to have an influence on the opening and closing of ion channels, changing the voltage of cells. So that's number one. Number two is we know that we can shut thoughts off with anesthetics. So we're trying to understand how anesthetics works. And we have discovered that anesthetics, depending on the isotope of the anesthetic, it'll have a different effect. And we can model that effect if we use a radical pair mechanism to model it, meaning that it's almost as if the anesthetics work by sort of disabling that quantum antenna. So again, the radical pair mechanism is something I studied for my PhD dissertation as potentially allowing birds to sense the Earth's magnetic field. So we have a lot of data on how this radical pair mechanism works. And I think it's really exciting to see these sort of two pieces of evidence of how it could be implicated in consciousness, especially because being a quantum antenna, that radical pair could potentially access information from the quantum vacuum via the virtual photons that are popping in and out of existence from the quantum vacuum. So again, my theory is that that information in the quantum vacuum, that our thought streams are actually signaling to these radical pair quantum antenna via the bursts of light that emerge from the quantum vacuum. And if that were the case, then the entanglement through space and the entanglement through time that we have in the quantum vacuum could be accessed by minds quite easily if they focus in upon it.
I want to ask you one thing. This is not on the list. It just hit me. Is there any way where quantum, and this might go into a little bit of my next questions, but is there any way where quantum entangling with other consciousness information in other I'm going past solar systems, multiverses, other universes, other dimensions?
Yeah. Well, Um,
And not just our consciousness, could like our planets, like the spin of our planets, this weird mathematical, I guess is it who's it? Dean Radin calls it the elegant universe, or like this weird mathematical perfection of
mm,
everything. Could it be quantum entangling with like some form of mathematical information stored in higher levels or other universes or
yeah,
multiverses?
I think what's incredible is that psychics have access to information beyond what their senses can give them. And I think if that information exists in the quantum vacuum, it that's a way that you could explain how that access could occur, based on one's intention and one's targeting. Um, there, there was another instance of Ingo Swann doing remote viewing of the rings of Saturn before the probe arrived, days before the probe arrived to take the first pictures of Saturn. Ingo Swann remote viewed Saturn and saw that there were rings and drew rings. And everyone was like, you're crazy. There are no rings on Saturn. We can see that from our telescopes. But then, sure enough, when the probe got there several days later and took the photos, there actually were rings. So this sight, or this ability to perceive other solar systems, I think, I don't think there doesn't seem to be necessarily a limit on that. Um, when it comes to other universes, um, that's that's an open question, or I guess we have to distinguish between the idea of other universes and other dimensions, right? Um, yeah.
I just say
And
that's kind of going into my next question. So I'm going to
yeah,
ask you how
sure.
consciousness ties into three phenomena. String theory. There we're going into other dimensions. How do you think does your theory or thoughts, consciousness, afterlife consciousness, non-local consciousness, anything I haven't thought of to ask, and string theory? Because I am obsessed with string theory. Like I think about it basically probably like 10 hours a day.
Well, I was obsessed with string theory too. I think it was one of the first things that excited me about physics. Reading the popular science books by Brian Greene, about string theory and watching those documentaries. It was just so exciting. And I think what really attracted me to string theory was this idea of multiple dimensions, this idea that what we see isn't necessarily all there is. So
Yeah, maybe explain what string theory is, because I'm like obsessed with it in this conceptual way, but I can't even put it together enough to explain it. So,
of course. Well, Um, I think the important thing to keep in mind, I think the important idea that comes out of string theory is this idea of higher dimensions, and that information could exist in another dimension. And I'm going to just full disclosure about string theory. Unfortunately, in its current formulation, it doesn't seem that that theory in and of itself is necessarily correct, um, based on the fact that they didn't find something called supersymmetry. So there are these other particles that they needed to find in the Large Hadron Collider that they didn't end up finding. And so it's looking doubtful that string theory in its current formulation is going to be a confirmed theory, or one that scientists are kind of moving away from it. But there were a lot of really interesting concepts in mathematics that came out of it that are still very relevant. And this idea of higher dimensions, I think, is still an interesting one. So to help you understand higher dimensions, it's easier to understand how our three dimensions relates to a lower dimension. So imagine you are confined to two dimensions, like you're an ant crawling on the table in front of you, right? And if I were to lay pieces of paper on the table, right, and coat the table in paper, eventually I'd run out of space, right? But what I could do is I could get a filing um, drawers, and I could set that on top of the table, and I could put more papers there in the higher third dimension. So when I run out of room in two dimensions, there's more room if you go up into three dimensions. So if I were to pick one of those pieces of paper off the table, if an ant were walking by, it would say, oh my goodness, that piece of paper just magically disappeared. It's magic. It just poof out of thin air. It disappeared. Well, it didn't disappear. I'm a third dimensional being. I lifted it into a third dimension that ant does not have access to. It can't see. It can only see the plane of the table and in its two dimensions. So this idea of something popping in and out of existence, I know I said that about the quantum vacuum, where I'm saying minds live. Well, what is the vacuum? Well, if you were to sort of, if all the matter in the universe were to disappear, all the atoms, everything were to disappear, space would not be empty. There would be bursts of energy popping in and out of existence at all times. And these bursts of energy, where do they come from? Just saying they come from the quantum vacuum. It's very reminiscent of the analogy I just gave you about something passing in and out through dimensionality. Now, we don't really think of the quantum vacuum as being in another dimension, because by definition, if something is in another dimension, we don't have access to it. So the important thing we need to focus on is, if there is another dimension, it has to interface with our dimension in some way, right? Imagine a bug floating on the surface of a pond, right? Like a little firefly or something lands on the surface of a pond, and imagine a golf ball falls into the pond, right? Imagine if you could only see the three-dimensional sphere of the ball through the view of the two-dimensional surface of the water. What would you see? You'd see a dot that expands into a circle that then expands back or shrinks down into a dot. So you're only ever seeing a part of the reality. But the point is even though the sphere exists in three dimensions, we still have access to a slice of it. And so even if virtual particles were popping in and out of existence from, say, another dimension, the important bit is what we see when they're in our dimension and what information are we getting. So same thing with the quantum vacuum. You might imagine the quantum vacuum as another dimension where spirits exist, minds exist, consciousness exists. But there still has to be a point where it interfaces with our three dimensions, the neurons in our brain, right? There has to be some access point. And that's what I'm proposing the radical pairs are, that quantum antenna. And again, just to clarify what a radical pair is, you have two atoms. Normally, the number of electrons and protons is equal so that there's no charge. But if you have a pair of atoms where one donates an electron to the other, it can become a radical pair where the sort of electron spins, there's an electron spin imbalance, and those electron spins are entangled. And they oscillate in that sort of up-down way, this sort of binary outcome where they're either parallel or they're anti-parallel. And that then signals a change in certain chemical reactions. So that's a really well-documented mechanism. And again, that quantum antenna could be an interface with the quantum vacuum, because we know these radical pairs do interact with quantum vacuum fluctuations, specifically virtual photons that are popping in and out of existence from the quantum vacuum. So the point is we need to keep our eye on what is that interface between our world and their world. That's why I kind of like to think of these virtual photons popping in and out of existence as the veil. I know a lot of mediums talk about when they do a reading, they're sort of meeting the other side at that interface, at that veil, where the spirits are kind of communicating to them and they're communicating with spirits, and they're doing it through this veil. And I wonder if the spirits are information streams in the quantum vacuum. And, our minds are, of course, these three-dimensional neuronal structures with these quantum antenna. And I'm wondering if those virtual photons popping in and out of existence, or maybe back and forth between our dimension and theirs, are the veil that we're meeting at to communicate.
I've wondered something kind of similar, but a lot less intelligently and a lot less educatedly. So yeah, I mean, I think this makes the most sense of any explanation I've ever heard for what that's worth as myself not a physicist. Hey everyone. I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in the next phenomena. Same question. How does it tie in? Black holes.
Hmm. Well, it's really interesting. I didn't study a lot about black holes because, physicists are really in two camps. There are the physicists that study the small things using quantum mechanics, and then the physicists that study the big things using Einstein's theory of relativity, right? And so we kind of have these two different camps. And the holy grail of physics right now, which string theory was trying to do, is to unify those two. Because there are situations where we have really small things with a lot of mass, and that would be the black hole situation, where we have a lot of gravity because there's a lot of mass. Black holes are very massive stars that have the masses condensed and contracted on itself. So you have a lot of mass in a small area of space. So quantum mechanics and relativity apply. And that really is, I think, where relativistic quantum information, this sort of new branch of physics that's sort of really been getting started, I should say, in the past 2 decades. And RQI really is looking at that intersectionality. Well, they're looking at how to probe the quantum vacuum. They have really interesting experiments that I've talked about where you can entangle two space-like separated objects via harvesting entanglement from the vacuum. You can access information about distance objects non-locally without light signaling. So, non-locally accessing information through space-like and time-like separated objects, so through space and through time. They've also done energy teleportation experiments of teleporting energy via the vacuum from one location to another. No one get any ideas. It doesn't mean that we're going to solve the climate crisis by accessing energy from the quantum vacuum. It's in an equilibrium state, so it's really only concentrated energy where there's an energy flow that can be harnessed for work, sort of like, like a water mill. Because the river is flowing, you can use the water mill to get work and do things with it. But if you just have a perfectly still pond, it's not going to generate much energy for you, even though there's a lot of water there. Same thing with the quantum vacuum. So not to confuse that. In fact, if you want to teleport energy, you actually have to put more energy in than what you get out. That's just sort of basic thermodynamics there. But I just want to clarify that because there have been a lot of ideas in the past of people wanting to get perpetual energy from the quantum vacuum. So I just want to make sure that people know I'm not talking about that. But anyway, this field of relativistic quantum information, they do a lot of work in analyzing black holes in terms of different effects like Hawking radiation and the Unruh effect. You can watch YouTube videos on these. I won't go into them, but it really does give you a lot of examples of how quantum vacuum fluctuations, or these virtual particles that I've been talking about, these particles popping in and out of existence, how they're real, the impacts they have around black holes. I don't know if black holes in and of themselves are, related to consciousness or how they might be. There was an interesting video that was just put out about reviewing sort of Einstein's original thoughts on black holes. He was thinking Einstein described um, gravity in terms of warps in space-time. And he was wondering, maybe we could describe particles, subatomic particles, as a warping of space-time as well, and therefore unify the math of the small and the math of the big. That's what he was working on up until the end of his life. And he speculated, maybe particles could be kind of like a black hole, kind of like a warping of space-time in that way. And he never really was able to sort of confirm that idea, but it's interesting that one of the greatest scientific minds ever known was thinking about black holes in that way.
And you talked about teleportation. Do you think that ties into apports? Do you know about apports?
I don't. I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. Well, I'll just tell you and we can move on if you don't have any opinion. It's like when you get a sign, like an object will appear out of nowhere. I don't, I'm not all saying you need to read my book, but did you read my book with like when the feathers seem to appear out of nowhere in my dad's favorite color, or like someone will walk in and a feather appears out of nowhere? And I mean, this seems to happen a lot. Dr. Stanley Krippner studied apports a lot, but in like parapsychology, objects seem to appear seemingly out of nowhere. And again, that's happened to me, and I'm as skeptical as you get. It's happened to other people. So I'm wondering if teleportation of any sorts could relate to that, if you had any thoughts. But if you haven't thought about apports, you probably don't.
Yeah. At this point, I would say teleportation, at least in terms of what we've seen in scientific experiments, has really been isolated to kind of teleportation of information, not necessarily physical objects. When it comes to consciousness affecting physical matter, the only evidence I've seen of that is in Dr. Friedman's studies on psychokinesis, which I really think are game changers because in the past, parapsychology studies have suffered from this sort of low effect size, meaning, yes, you can see an effect, you can measure effect in the laboratory, but it's a small effect, right? You can look at the PEAR experiments, PEAR, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research experiments. They did decades of these psychokinesis experiments, but it never really gained widespread attention from the scientific community because of the low statistical significance. And I think that's what the more recent study, the 2004 paper that Dr. Friedman released, I think really changes the game on that because they were able to achieve a high significance by disabling the functioning in the left frontal lobe hemisphere. And in doing that, it seems like they described it as the mind being a filter of psi activity, or in my theory, I'm thinking of it as sort of like your mind in the vacuum is sort of playing a piano, which are your neurons, right? And you're constantly playing both hemispheres, the left and the right of your brain. But if suddenly you don't have to play the left hemisphere, then it's free to maybe affect another quantum system, like a quantum tunneling event in another system that you're focused on. So in terms of mind affecting matter, that's all I can say scientifically, that in terms of like research studies that have been done in the lab. But the fact that you cite all of these other this other anecdotal evidence of larger objects appearing in people's path or appearing in people's space, that's encouraging that needs to be investigated, further and tested even more.
I didn't ask you this because it just hit me now. So I didn't send it to you in advance. I don't even know if you know about it, but if so, do you have any thoughts on shadow people and brain? BRANE, Stephen Hawking talking about shadow people and brain universes. If not, we'll just move on.
Oh yeah, I'm not very familiar with shadow people. I do know that brains are, I think, another sort of this other dimensionality that was put forth in string theory, sort of like what we talked about before. And I know string theorists theorize, well, if we, where are these other dimensions? We only see three dimensions. Why can't we see this other dimension? And so the idea was maybe they're curled up, among, really tiny, or this idea, of maybe they're like huge membranes, like so big, and we're just like water droplets on a shower curtain where we're stuck to this two-dimensional membrane, but there's this whole three-dimensional world beyond us. I'm not terribly familiar with a lot of the thinking there, but I think the reason ideas like the multiverse, where I mentioned the multiverse theory or higher dimensions theories, it's fine to speculate about them, but the issue is we don't have access to them. So I think what's important to keep in mind in any of those discussions is the interface between their world and our world, because that's where we can test. And if something is coming from that other universe into our universe, or that other dimension into our dimension, then that is information that this universe didn't have, that it suddenly has. And I think that's where some scientific investigation could be focused. Um, but I think that was obviously the criticism of things like multiverse and string theory is, well, you can't really test something that you will never, ever have access to. And so the key to testing is, is new information coming in to our dimension that before wasn't there? And where is that interface and how does that work? And I think that's where the science could be most fruitful.
And for all we know, it's coming in, but our brains can't process it. Like, to use a much more type of information that is much more aligned with similar to us, sounds that dogs can hear, or infrared and past infrared. We could be getting little bits of information that other bodies could easily interpret in a way we can't even imagine, like different colors, different sounds, and our bodies just can't interpret it. Maybe they're getting little spillovers of stuff that aligns to our senses.
Yeah, that's where I think what's interesting about that is sort of knowing what could this non-local information be and how could it be conveyed. Um, the electromagnetic spectrum, even though we can't hear or we can't see, sorry, the electromagnetic spectrum, we can't see beyond the colors of the rainbow, we do have other devices that can detect an electromagnetic spectrum outside of those ranges. Also, when you think about, sometimes people have speculated, well, maybe consciousness is a new type of particle, right? Or something like that. And I think the only thing there, though, is with the particle accelerators that we have, we've found all the particles that there are that we have to work with. The reason I say that is other particles that, or even electromagnetic radiation, I think it's easy to understand. Like, I think originally when we first discovered electricity, people thought, well, maybe psychic information is transmitted through light, electromagnetic radiation, like light signals, electromagnetic radiation signals. But again, if we come back to the interface with neurons, it's only in the visible light range where biological systems can sort of are sensitive to light signals within that range, or molecules, I should say, are sensitive within that visual spectrum range or the UV range. But the radio frequency range is just too big, and it's not sensitive to that, and they're too weak energetically. On the other extreme, things like X-rays and gamma rays can irradiate atoms, right? Can knock electrons out of their orbitals and cause mutations and cause cancer. I always ask my students, so you can stand in a room of white light, which has all the colors of the rainbow, right? And the only difference between the colors of the rainbow and X-rays are the frequency or the wavelength of the wave. So why can I stand in a room of white light all day long, but not in an X-ray room all day long? What's the difference if they're the same thing? It's all just light. Well, the X-rays have a much smaller wavelength. So I have my students visualize that that can penetrate into your cells in your body, and it has a lot more energy. So it can knock electrons out away from atoms and ionize, right? Why do we protect ourselves from ultraviolet radiation, the violet end? Because those are smaller wavelengths and they can cause damage to our cells. Whereas, standing in a room of red light, we don't have that problem. So again, I think the point is looking at, we know that light exists. We know there's this whole spectrum, but what could interact with the brain? Because again, whatever psychic information is, even when a psychic is getting a reading, it still is registering in their brain. Like if they're visualizing something, the visual cortex is lighting up. And so, if there are other particles or other things that have higher energy, we would have found it in our particle accelerators, or we would have been able to detect anything that could interact with the brain. So I think what we're looking for has to be something that we already have found in terms of a physical mechanism. It has whatever psychic information is interacting with on the physical level, it has to be something I think that we've already found physically, which is encouraging because it means that we could be close. We don't necessarily need to invent new physics.
Could we, oh my God, if we could prove non-local consciousness and afterlife. And I mean, do you think we'll ever have something as good as, like, I've heard of things called like phones where you can just like talk on the phone with your loved ones after they pass? Are we gonna have, like, do hey, how are you? Maybe you have to use Morse code or something rather than English or whatever your native language is. Are we gonna have something like that, you think? Or
Well, I know that's certainly my goal. With my theory, I'm looking at ways that it could be tested. Um, and right now what we have is we have a medium, which is one person communicating with a mind on the other side. And that mind is cognitive. I mean, spirits, after they pass, they report on things that have happened since they died. They report how they feel about it, what they think about it. So they're still thinking, they're perceiving, they're doing all of those things. And right now, the only way we have of getting that information is through mediums. It and the issue with that scientifically is we have to rely on what the medium is saying. We have to rely on what the sitter is saying, whether the information is accurate or not. There's a lot of, in science, we kind of want to sort of nail down the mechanism, and how you nail down the mechanism is is really focalizing on eliminating as many variables, extraneous variables as possible. So and there are ideas. I mean, we're developing what are called organoids, brain organoids. So in Petri dish, we're growing brains from neuron cells. Yeah. Yeah, we're growing little brains. And they're doing,
seriously? Holy
oh
shit, that's
yes, I would
insane.
encourage
Okay.
anyone. I just spoke at the Science of Consciousness 2024, presented by the University of Arizona, their Center for Consciousness. You can find their YouTube videos on their channel, their YouTube channel. And one of the last speakers is a pioneering research in brain organoids. And they're doing all kinds of things. You can think of the neurons in these organoids as like an electrical circuit. And so the neurons, they are firing. It's sort of random, right? There's no like coherent brainwaves or coherent thoughts that are necessarily coming out. But imagine you were to, we're able now with, I mentioned Alexander Huth, who did the brain mind reading experiments, where they took fMR data from people's brains while they were listening to stories, and basically were able to map, if this area of your brain lights up, it means you're thinking about this. essentially. So that when the person then reads a book or watches a film, just from the brain activity, they can determine what the person is thinking to some extent. So imagine you can record that same data on a brain organoid, an artificial brain, and right now it's just random. But what if an image were to appear, right? What if you had patients in hospice who agreed to participate in a study where after they pass, they're given a secret image, right? In an envelope, and it's double, triple, quadruple blind, and that person knows what their image is, and then when they pass over, they're asked to communicate that image to this brain organoid, and we with fMRI are able to register that and say, oh, look, yep, that person, they signaled their mind to the neurons in this assigned organoid, and they signaled the right image. That might be proof that of survival. And that's something that could conceivably be done if we can better understand not just scientists, but I think in collaboration with mediums, talking to those on the other side. Now that you are on the other side, how does that tethering mechanism work? I think that's my question. How is it that one mind in the vacuum is assigned to one brain? Why are and
You mean while we're
that,
here, like we're here, are the consciousness source is non-local, and why when we're alive is that one, like why is it assigned to me here? And
right,
why are you assigned to you and at this time? And
right.
then
How does
at there
that,
times we're probably assigned to nobody and we're just assigned, or maybe we're assigned to some other type of being, physical being, or some other beings that we can't even imagine and dimensions we can't imagine.
exactly. It's like a cell phone. I mean, that's the best analogy that we have. I mean, my cell phone only gets calls to my cell phone. It's that broadcast, that frequency is specific to the configuration of the antenna in my cell phone, my channel, right? Um, how is that determined? And once someone is discarnate, could they broadcast to neurons in some other brain, like a brain organoid or something like that? That's something that's of interest to me is how that tuning actually works. And not in the documentary, but I have a supplemental documentary. It's actually more footage than in the main documentary that's free, but it's a download to purchase. But one of the mediums, Carolyn, talks about a story of her mother, who was also a medium, having an out-of-body experience and then having to fight for her body when she got back by someone else trying to get in. So I'm super fascinated by stories like that to see, well, how does that work? We also have a really interesting conversation about schizophrenia and how maybe there could be some dual signaling coming in, or maybe it's just a person who's very psychic listening to someone else's mind in the vacuum and then taking that information. Or we have something like dissociative identity disorder, where someone really does have different personalities. Um, One amazing study done in Germany, I think it was a German woman who some of her identities were blind. And when the blind personality was active, even though her eyes were open and she was showing visual information, the visual cortex of her brain scan wasn't lighting up. But when her seeing personality comes back, the visual cortex is lighting up and it's immediate. Now, that's not something you can fake. And that again supports this idea that the mind or the personality is somehow maybe signaling to the neurons and activating the activity in the neurons, that it's not the neurons that are causing the personality to emerge, but that the neurons are just a receiver, an antenna, and the broadcast is happening somewhere else. So maybe when you have this split personality situation, maybe there are two broadcasts. So that's, I think, where I'm most interested in looking next, is really understanding the mechanism by which that tuning is taking place.
Yes. Oh my God. And that brain you're talking, the brain, mini brain, like the Argonaut, if no personality is assigned to it, maybe down the line it could be set up. I mean, maybe that's why, like our deceased loved one's consciousness will like send information to a medium who has their own personality assigned to themselves. But if it was like a personality-less brain, I mean, it might be just the perfect way to communicate on our own with our loved ones down the line. I mean, yeah,
Right.
I love getting medium
That
readings,
would
but
that would
if
be that would be my holy grail, is a communication tool. Because and I think it's really important, because it seems like these minds have an interest in communicating with us. It's not that they don't want to, they're interested in communicating with us. And I think what's fascinating is it's sort of like a first contact situation. We talk about making an alien first contact. I think this is a first contact um, possibility for our human civilization, where we can have contact with these minds, these intelligences that seem to have a larger perspective than we do, a larger cognitive light cone, if you will. Michael Levin at Tufts University, he coined this term cognitive light cone as, for any species, there's a certain amount of information that they can remember and they can plan for. And there's a certain breadth of concepts that they can grasp and things that they can care about in their environment. So, for example, your dog has a memory and can imagine, right? Your pet, but it's not worried about what's happening in the town next door. It doesn't really have the capacity to plan for that or see that, or we humans, we have a capacity to care about the globe as a whole, to care about not just our immediate past and our immediate future, but also our children's future and the earth that we're going to leave for them to inhabit. And you hear stories from mediums or channelers where they're talking to beings that have such a broad, almost godlike cognitive light cone, where they can see trajectories, things that are coming in time that we can't even perceive of. And they seem to care about not just the growth or the future of our human progress, but their progress as well. So for me, I'm focused on, I try not to get bogged down in a lot of the stories that come, like when mediums talk to spirits, there are all sorts of ideas about what the afterlife is like and what is the meaning of life. And all of those things are very fascinating. And I do take those into account when I'm thinking about my own personal belief system. But from a scientific perspective, I think the first step is to figure out, how can we have a scientifically proven, documented means of communication with those on the other side that wish to communicate with us? And then I leave it to the theologians and the sociologists and the anthropologists to then have those conversations and to begin understanding that world, because there seems to be a whole slew of societal structures and norms and customs. And honestly, I think that's why we have so many religions, because, one prophet speaks to someone on the other side and gets one set of information and another gets a different set of information. So I don't want to argue who's right, which philosophy is right, but I think what I'm proposing is that we can at least validate that getting those messages is real, right? Regardless of whose message you believe.
Well, I also just have a question about the Argo, or I'm not pronouncing it right, but the little lab-grown brains. Are they using brain tissue mimicking living brains, or is it like more like a cell phone, like data technology that's serving a purpose and functioning like a brain?
Oh no, these brain organoids are actual brains. They are living tissues. I believe human stem
Insane.
cells, they start and then they grow them into neurons and then they form neural networks. So they're studying how brains develop. And they very spontaneously form these neural networks and they start actually, having action potentials and calcium spikes and all the things we see in our brain activity. It's just not coordinated, right? Our brain activity, you have these brain waves, you have this synchronized activity across the brain that corresponds to coherent thought, especially when someone is conscious, which is different from when they're unconscious or under anesthetics. Um, but these brain organoids definitely are real organic cells. They're actual cells.
Whoa. And then we'll just see, like, no matter what, like a tipping point of what it takes to be conscious. Well, they download consciousness for a set period of time. And I know there's some people who think, well, if they become conscious, that shows it's created by a brain. That's not necessarily true. It could still be downloading the consciousness.
Exactly, exactly. And there are a lot of ethical issues and a lot of questions in regards to where is that threshold being crossed when it comes to the brain organoid research. I'll mention another study by Michael Levin, which I think is really interesting, where he developed a brand new organism called a xenobot. And how he did it is he took skin cells from a frog, right? Skin cells from a frog over evolutionary timescales, they only evolved to be skin cells. They have little cilia, but that's about it. He puts them in the petri dish and gives them nutrients. And in time, they ball up and they develop cilia, these little hairs that propel cells around. And then they start moving around. They start having these kind of behaviors that seem to represent agency, where they're going around corners and in the fluid, where they're kind of moving around one another as if they have collective behaviors. And then most strikingly, they start reproducing by gathering up excess cell material and gathering it into little balls so that then those cells become xenobots. So the question then is, okay, we think that, or scientists think that everything can be explained by Darwinian evolution, right? But these xenobots, where did they get those behaviors from? It didn't come from, it didn't come from evolution. They were just skin cells of a frog. That's all they were evolved to be. So where are all of these conscious agential behaviors coming from? Where is all this agency coming from? So I think it's an interesting question as we go deeper into these organoids and xenobots and all of these things.
And that, yeah, I mean, for all we know, maybe we were created like, I mean, I'm completely joking when I say this, but like, like a god, like a type of big person like us who's just like, let me put these cells together. Not a god who's like some super like higher spiritual being, but just someone who's like, we're in a lab and someone's like, oh, cool, look at this. They're talking to each but they might not even know the word talking. They're making noises at each other and seem to be conscious. And like, here we are, like in this ridiculous human lives. And it's
at this point, who knows?
Who knows? Now I have, do you have time for like two final questions? I know
Sure.
this has all been so long. I completely lost track of time. I just looked up. I was like, oh, she's going to kill me. And then you come back in over an hour. In terms of consciousness, time-wise, like, do you think our consciousness, when would you say it developed? Do you think it was before the big crunch? Will it survive after the big bang? To what extent would our consciousness tie in with big crunch, big bang, and long-term time?
Well, this is, of course, just speculation, but I think my working hypothesis that I'm working with is that that information in the quantum vacuum is more primordial, and that the world that we see is a subset of that information. And I think mine is the only theory that postulates that. I think other theories, such as OR, which we talked about, and Kastrup's, I know, talks about the primordial consciousness is sort of like a proto-consciousness. It doesn't really have a lot of information, and that it's only the human brain that then shapes that consciousness into the complex information streams that we think of ourselves to have. And I kind of take the opposite view. I think there's more information, more minds in the quantum vacuum than are being reflected in physical reality. And so I'm thinking that physical reality is sort of a manifestation of that information in the vacuum. Um, I shared an interesting story of speaking to another channeler medium, Esther Hicks, and actually wanted to ask a question. I find she channels Abraham, and I find some of the philosophies very interesting. And again, a lot of the information you get through mediums, the stories that you get or the philosophies that you get, I, as a scientist, don't necessarily take them as fact, but I take them as interesting pointers and interesting ways of thinking, what if that were true? How could we test that? And so I asked Abraham, I said, what is the difference between, you say all the thoughts that have ever been thought are still in existence. I thought that was an interesting concept. Where are those thoughts? Because we know that physical matter is a vibration. Actually, didn't get into this, but an electron really isn't a particle. It's actually a vibration, a perturbation of electron field. But that's quantum field theory. There are great videos you can watch on that. But I said, okay, I understand that matter is vibration and thought is vibration, but we can measure matter vibrations. Where are the thought vibrations, especially those of someone who is deceased? And where are those thought vibrations if they persist? And I think Abraham said, "Oh, you've got a misconception. You're thinking that there's anything other than thought vibrations. That electron is an actual thought vibration. That the perturbation of the electron field itself is a thought. It's just a perpetual thought that is." So this idea that maybe thoughts are more fundamental, maybe mind is what that information of mind is fundamental, and a field is just an information field, and a perturbation of that field, again, is just kind of information. So I think that in terms of the Big Bang and the Big Crunch or whatever happens before or after, I think personally that consciousness could be, that information could be primordial, and what we're seeing reflected in physical reality is just a subset of that information. Almost like I liken it to my son. He's got a lot of ideas in his head and he loves Legos. And so just because he builds one thing, that doesn't mean that's the only thing he can build and that's the only thing he ever will build. He's in the process of creating more and more and more and more. And I kind of think that that intelligence is where the agency is coming from, and it's pushing through in our physical world. Now, that's just my take on it, and it remains to be seen if that's the case.
Fantastic. And then lastly, the many worlds theory, not multiverse, but that there's all this collapse, we're living like infinite or more than one at least versions of ourselves. Like we did take the path left instead of right when we decided. We did say yes to that job or that boyfriend, and which led to a trajectory of a whole different life, and that all those lives and choices are going on. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. Remember, I think when we talk about the double slit experiment, it helps you put into perspective the motivation for that many worlds interpretation. It was, you have an equation that says the electron goes through there's a probability it goes left, there's a probability it goes right. You add that up and there's a probability it goes through both. And the fact that we only see one outcome, what happened to the other outcome? Well, someone says, and the reason someone wanted to say that outcome still exists is because if it doesn't exist, then the world is random, right? That the world is fundamentally probabilistic. And so a scientist not liking the idea that the world is probabilistic and instead wanted a world to be deterministic, right? Meaning there's a Big Bang, you can calculate what's going to happen from there, right? There's no free will, it just deterministically unravels. from that desire, the idea of many worlds was invented. Well, maybe we just don't see the other reality. Maybe it's not 50% chance this happens and 50% chance that happens. Maybe both happen. It's just only one happens in our universe and another universe is immediately created. And think of the number of universes that would have to be created. Every time any electron or subatomic particle interacts with another subatomic particle, a new universe would be created, where the only difference is that subatomic particle had a spin up, and in this one, it had a spin down. For me, that seems a little bit wonky, just to preserve this idea of things are deterministic and not random. What makes more sense to me is the pilot wave theory, that there's this wave that makes things look like they're moving randomly, right? That makes outcomes seem random, but it's not. Particles are just moving with these wave fluctuations. And the thing about the wave is that it's entangled, meaning that what happens, it's sort of like if you were to kick a football into a soccer net, or a soccer ball into a soccer net, right? You can predict exactly where it's going to go, right? Every time you kick, unless there's a little bit of wind, right? And that wind is like the pilot wave that kind of brings in what looks to be random, but it's not really random. If you could calculate, there's an equation that describes wind, you could calculate how the wind is going to affect your kick. But what if, bringing in butterfly effect, what if your kick is being affected by someone else's kick in a stadium, one town away? That's affecting the wind somehow. So that's what's happening, is every particle's position and changes in that position, that information is being reflected in the pilot wave, and the pilot wave is being updated with all the information from all particles in physical existence instantly, because it's entangled. Not at light speed or taking time, but there's this instant non-local update of the entire pilot wave in the entire universe. And so I say this in the documentary, is it that the pilot wave is reflective of the physical world, or is the physical world just a reflection of the information in the pilot wave, right? Or the information in the quantum vacuum? And again, there's a paper that postulates that the pilot wave is the quantum vacuum fluctuations, the virtual particles, those virtual photons popping in and out of existence. They're sort of like a bubbling sea or a pilot wave. And just as Bohm predicted of the pilot wave, he predicted it was entangled, this entangled non-local field that sort of guides the motion of particles. Well, that's sort of what we see with virtual particles and the quantum vacuum. It's the store of information that can be accessed, and it is bubbling with virtual particles, like a bubbling ocean.
Amazing. This is probably the longest podcast I've ever done. I'll break it up into 2 or 3 episodes. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like me to? Anything you want to share? Obviously, I'll ask you to tell everyone where they can find you, remind them the name of your documentary, all of that. But is there anything physics related I haven't asked you that you'd like to talk about?
Oh, goodness. I'm sure there's more, but we can save it for another conversation.
Oh
And
my God, I'll make you come back. You'll kill me.
yeah. Um, the documentary is called Playing My Mind Symphony. It's at my website, psychicphysics.com. And I also have my talk that I gave on my theory of non-local consciousness, vacuum orchestrated spin signaling at the Science of Consciousness 2024. So that is also can be found through the YouTube link on my website as well. And I'm happy to answer questions that people have. Feel free to contact me as well through the website with any questions on the theory.
And I'll link to all of that in my show notes. Thank you so much for giving so much time. You have answered questions I've been asking for like 6 years and no one knows the answer to. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you for what you're doing and for connecting the community that you're creating. It's amazing. You're really asking the right questions, and these are the conversations we all need to be having with one another to move the science forward. So I'm super excited.
Do you think, by the way, I should, one last thing, do you think mainstream science is ever going to start exploring consciousness and survival of consciousness in a serious way?
Hmm. Um, you know, when the evidence is strong, then things become undeniable. And so I think we're getting there. I think part of it was a mechanism, finding at least a first mechanism by which it could be possible. And I think that's what's motivating my work. And hopefully it will encourage others to dive in and test it and question it and come up with maybe their own examples or tweaks, their own theories of how this could be possible. But I think we're close.
Hi. So exciting news. Book number 2, WTF Just Happened. A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Even More Evidence of an Afterlife and Fights for Justice with Her Dead Dog is ready. You can get it everywhere in both ebook and paper. This book essentially picks up where WTF Part 1 left off. I continue to experience a bunch of what the fuckery, and it's a bit different now because I know the mediums pretty well, so I get some actual opinions on what they thought of me when they first met me. I get more crazy signs, and the evidence just keeps accumulating. I keep bugging my dad for that one sign I really, really wanted, and some really crazy stuff happens related to that. I conduct experiments with psychic medium Joe Peretta, and again, bunch of what the fuckery. And in a really weird twist, I get called as a secondary witness to testify in the Harvey Weinstein case, which is a secondary plot. And that results in my dog, Peanut, who is on the other side and sending me some signs, ends up becoming famous. So, if you want to keep hearing about scientific evidence of an afterlife and this really bizarre side story, you can go order my second book in the series. I love getting to say it that now. WTF Just Happens, actually a series. So you can go to my website, and that links to everywhere this book's available. It's available in ebook and print, not yet audiobook. That's not going to be nearly as long as it was for book 1, but it's going to be a few more months. So you can go to my website and order WTF Just Happened. A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Even More Evidence of an Afterlife and Fights for Justice with Her Dead Dog. To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There you can order my book, WTF Just Happened. A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing, fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?